On a rain-soaked morning that was supposed to be ordinary, one small decision shattered everything he believed about his life. He changed his route to work to help a desperate friend. Nothing heroic, just loyalty, but fate had other plans. Through the fogged glass of a quiet cafe, he saw his wife laughing with another man, leaning in close, passing something across the table like a secret that didn't belong to him. In that instant, love felt like a lie, trust like a cruel joke, and justice painfully absent. He pulled over, heart pounding, torn between confronting her and uncovering the truth, hiding in plain sight. What he didn't know was that this moment wasn't the end of his marriage. It was the beginning of a far darker story involving betrayal, fear, and a truth powerful enough to destroy lives. Before we dive in, take a second to comment your country and local time below. And if you enjoy gripping, cinematic stories like this, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. He didn't mean to stop the car so abruptly. The tires scraped the curb with a sharp, accusing sound, and for a second, he thought someone behind him might honk, shout, and force him back into the world of normal rules. But no one did. The street remained indifferent. Rain tapped against the windshield like impatient fingers, and all he could do was sit there, hands locked around the steering wheel, staring through the cafe window across the street. She was unmistakable. Same posture, same way she tucked her hair behind her ear when she laughed, as if the gesture belonged only to moments of comfort. He had seen that movement 1,000 times at home over dinner, while brushing her teeth, when she thought no one was watching, and now she was doing it for someone else. The man across from her leaned forward, his face half-shadowed by the warm glow of the hanging lights. He wasn't touching her. That almost made it worse. There was an ease between them, an intimacy that didn't need hands to announce itself. They spoke softly, heads close together, like conspirators. Then came the moment that froze his blood. She slid something small across the table. Not a phone, not money. Something deliberate, something planned. His chest tightened until breathing felt optional. This wasn't how betrayal was supposed to look. There was no dramatic kiss, no obvious guilt, just calm, control, precision, as if whatever they were doing had been rehearsed long before this morning, long before he'd taken that detour. The irony burned. He had changed his route to help a friend in trouble, a friend who had called him late the night before with a voice cracked by fear. Begging for a favor, just swing by in the morning, the friend had said. Please, I wouldn't ask if it wasn't serious. Loyalty had always been his weakness. He said yes without hesitation, and now loyalty had delivered him straight into humiliation. A familiar voice rose in his head, sharp and poisonous. Of course this is happening. Of course you're the fool who finds out like this. He wanted to storm across the street, rip the cafe door open, demand answers in front of strangers. He imagined the look on her face, shock, guilt, excuses, spilling too late. The fantasy lasted less than a heartbeat, because beneath the anger was something colder, something far more unsettling. Fear. The exchange at the table hadn't looked romantic. It had looked urgent, and the man hadn't smiled once. As if sensing his gaze, she glanced toward the window. He ducked instinctively, heart slamming so hard it made his vision blur. When he looked again, she was standing, pulling on her coat. The man rose too, already turning away, slipping out through a side door without a backward glance. She lingered just long enough to tuck the object into her bag, her face tightening not with guilt, but with something closer to dread. He watched her step outside, rain dotting her hair, scanning the street before walking briskly to her car. She didn't see him, or maybe she did, and chose not to. His phone buzzed in his pocket. The sound made him flinch. A text from the same friend who'd asked for help. Did you change your route? His throat went dry. He didn't answer. She drove off, taking a turn she never took on the way to work. He sat there another 10 seconds, fighting the urge to scream, then turned the key and followed at a distance that felt both safe and humiliating. Every red light was torture. Every car between them felt like fate mocking him. As he drove, memories assaulted him without mercy. Late nights, when she said she was working, the way she'd grown quieter over the past few weeks, how he'd chalked it up to stress, to his own absence, to the slow erosion that happens in long marriages when life gets heavy. He had told himself love was resilient, that trust, once earned, didn't evaporate so easily. He wondered how long he'd been lying to himself. Another text buzzed in. "Please don't go home yet." That one sent a chill down his spine. He finally replied with shaking thumbs. "Why?" The reply came almost instantly. "Because if you see what's coming the wrong way, you'll make it worse. I swear I'm trying to protect you." Protect you. The words felt like an insult. She pulled into a multi-level parking garage near a row of offices, legal firms, clinics, places people went to solve problems quietly. Not hotels, not restaurants. Problems. He parked 2 levels down, heart hammering, and followed her inside, keeping his head low, every step echoing too loudly in his ears. He wasn't a spy. He was a man unraveling. Her heels clicked ahead of him as she entered an elevator. He stopped short, watching the doors slide shut, then pressed the call button with a hand that wouldn't stop trembling. As the elevator rose, he stared at their warped reflection in the steel walls. He barely recognized himself. This wasn't who he was supposed to be. The doors opened onto a hushed corridor. She turned left. He waited, counted to 5, then followed. Voices drifted through half-closed doors. A printer hummed. Somewhere, someone laughed. The normalcy felt obscene. He slowed when he heard her voice. "The timeline is tightening," she said quietly. "If this goes wrong, everything collapses." Another voice answered male, calm, unfamiliar. "I know, but if we rush it, we risk exposing him." "And if he finds out?" she asked. "If my husband finds out before it's done?" A pause. Then we lose the advantage." His vision darkened around the edges. Him. They were talking about him. He backed away before they could open the door, retreating down the hall like a thief. His phone vibrated again. A call this time. He didn't answer. He couldn't. His entire world had tilted, and nothing made sense anymore. He stumbled back into the rain-soaked street minutes later, lungs burning, mind racing. Infidelity had been the easy explanation, the one his pride could survive. But this was something else, something layered with secrecy, strategy, and fear. Whatever his wife was involved in, it wasn't an affair, and whatever it was, it had already pulled him into its gravity. As he sat in the car, soaked and shaking, one truth settled heavily in his chest. This story didn't begin with betrayal. It began long before that cafe, long before the detour, with a secret that had been growing in the dark. And now, whether he wanted it or not, he was part of it. He didn't go home. The idea of walking through the front door, pretending nothing had happened, felt impossible, like stepping onto a stage without knowing the script, while everyone else already knew the ending. Instead, he drove aimlessly, rain blurring the city into streaks of gray and amber, his thoughts spiraling faster than the wipers could keep up. Her voice echoed in his head. "If my husband finds out before it's done, before what was done?" The question gnawed at him. Betrayal he could process, lies he could confront, but this felt engineered, like he was standing in the middle of a machine that had been running long before he noticed the noise. And the worst part was the realization creeping into his chest. He might be the target. His phone buzzed again. He finally answered. "Where are you?" his friend asked. Voice low, tense, stripped of its usual sarcasm. "Not home," he said. "And don't lie to me. I saw her. I saw them." Silence stretched on the line, thick and heavy. When his friend finally spoke, it wasn't denial. He heard it was resignation. "Then things moved faster than I hoped," the friend said. "Listen to me. I need you to stay calm." "That's your advice," he snapped. "I just watched my wife hand something to a stranger and talk about me like I was a problem to be managed." "I know," his friend said quietly. "And I swear to you, it's not what it looks like, but it is dangerous." That word again, dangerous. Start explaining, he said, voice shaking despite his effort to steady it. Right now, there are people involved who don't play fair, his friend replied. People who ruin lives for leverage. I got tangled with them months ago. I thought I could handle it. I was wrong. His grip tightened on the steering wheel. The city lights reflected off the wet asphalt like fractured mirrors. And my wife? He asked. She found out after they started asking questions about you, his friend said. About your job, your accounts, your routines. Cold seeped into his bones. You're saying they're watching me. Yes. The admission hit harder than any accusation of infidelity ever could. He replayed the past weeks with brutal clarity. The unfamiliar car parked down the street. The way she'd insisted on new passwords. The tension in her shoulders whenever his phone rang late. She didn't tell me, he said. I know, his friend replied. Because they warned her not to, and because she was trying to protect you. The word protect landed differently this time. Less like an insult, more like a wound. He pulled into an empty lot near the river, killed the engine, and let the silence swallow him. Rain drummed on the roof, relentless and cold. So what was the cafe? He asked. A handoff, his friend said. A decoy. They're testing how much control they have. How fast she'll comply. And the man, he pressed. Not a lover, came the quick answer. A fixer. Someone who knows how to collect evidence without getting caught. Evidence. The word settled uneasily in his chest. Evidence of what? He asked. Of leverage, his friend said. And of crimes they don't want traced back to them. He laughed bitterly. You realize how insane this sounds? I do, his friend replied, and I wouldn't drag you into it if there was another way. But you're already in it. They chose you because you look clean, stable. The kind of man people believe. The unfairness of it all finally cracked something inside him. He had done everything right, worked hard, stayed loyal, built a quiet life. And now that very normalcy had painted a target on his back. So what now? He asked, exhausted. Now you don't confront her, his friend said firmly. Not yet. You act normal. You let us finish what we started. Us. He stared at the dark river beyond the windshield. You and her, he said. Yes, his friend admitted. And someone else. Someone who knows how to end this cleanly. The call ended soon after, leaving him alone with the rain and a truth he hadn't asked for. When he finally drove home hours later, the house was dark, except for the porch light she always left on for him. That small, familiar detail nearly undid him. She was in the kitchen when he stepped inside, hair damp, sleeves rolled up, as if she'd been scrubbing the counters for hours. She looked up, eyes widening just slightly before softening into something like relief. You're late, she said carefully. Traffic, he replied, the lie tasting strange on his tongue. They stood there, a few feet apart. Years of shared history stretched thin between them. He searched her face for guilt, for cracks. Instead, he saw fear she was trying desperately to hide. Dinner passed in cautious silence. Every word felt weighted, every glance measured. When she finally went to bed, he remained at the table, staring at the spot where she'd rested her hand moments earlier. That night, sleep refused to come. He lay awake, listening to the rhythm of her breathing, wondering how long she'd been carrying this alone, wondering if love was enough to survive secrets this heavy. The next morning, he began to notice things he'd overlooked before. A black sedan, idling at the corner when he left for work. A missed call from an unknown number that vanished when he tried to return it. A charge on their joint account that didn't match anything familiar. By lunchtime, paranoia had sharpened into focus. He took a walk, pretending to clear his head, and nearly collided with a man stepping out of his building. The stranger recovered quickly, offering an apologetic smile that didn't reach his eyes. Careful, the man said pleasantly. Wouldn't want anyone getting hurt. The words were innocuous. The tone was not. That evening, he found the storage unit receipt tucked inside an old jacket in the closet dated weeks earlier. rented under a name he didn't recognize. His name, however, was written in pen on the corner. That was when the fear finally became certainty. This wasn't just happening around him. It was happening because of him. As he sat on the edge of the bed, receipt trembling in his hand, he realized the most painful truth of all. His wife hadn't stepped away from him emotionally. She had stepped into fire, believing she could shield him from the flames. And now, whether he trusted her or not, he would have to decide what kind of man he was going to be, one who demanded answers or one who stood beside her when the danger finally revealed its face. The storage facility sat on the edge of the industrial district, a low concrete sprawl surrounded by chain-link fences and flickering security lights. It was the kind of place people forgot existed unless they had something to hide or something to protect. He parked across the street and sat there longer than he meant to, watching the entrance as rainwater pooled along the curb. Every instinct screamed at him to turn around, to pretend he'd never found the receipt, to let the professionals handle whatever nightmare this had become. But the name written in pen kept burning in his mind. His name. He crossed the street with his hood pulled low, each step echoing in his ears. Inside, the air smelled of dust and metal. The clerk barely looked up as he signed in, his movements automatic, his face tired and bored. Normal, almost insultingly normal, the unit was at the far end of the corridor. As he walked, he became acutely aware of every sound: footsteps, distant voices, the hum of fluorescent lights. He stopped twice, convinced he was being followed, only to find the hallway empty. Still, his pulse refused to slow. The lock clicked open with a dull, final sound. Inside, the unit was smaller than he'd imagined. Just a metal shelf, a plastic crate, and a cardboard box sealed with tape. No furniture, no clutter. Nothing that suggested long-term storage. This wasn't a place to forget things. It was a place to collect them. His hands shook as he peeled back the tape. At first, the contents didn't make sense. Folders filled with printed emails, spreadsheets, and legal-looking documents. Photographs slid loose and scattered across the floor. He crouched to pick them up, breath catching as he realized what they were. Him, leaving his office, sitting alone in his car, standing on his own porch, fumbling for his keys. Each image was time-stamped. Each one precise, deliberate. Someone had been watching him for weeks, maybe longer. A cold wave of nausea rolled through him. At the bottom of the box was a small burner phone wrapped in a cloth. He turned it on, half expecting it to explode in his hand. Instead, the screen flickered to life, displaying a single unsent message in the drafts folder. "If he finds out, we lose everything." He stared at the words until they blurred. Everything. What did that mean? Money? Freedom? Safety? The sound of tires crunching on gravel snapped his head up. He froze, listening. A car door slammed somewhere outside the unit. Footsteps approached, unhurried, confident. Whoever it was didn't care if they were heard. He shoved the phone into his pocket, heart hammering, and peered out through the narrow gap. A black sedan idled near the entrance, engine running. Two men stood beside it, talking quietly. One glanced down the corridor. His blood ran cold. He didn't think. He acted. He slipped out the back exit, moving fast but trying not to run, cutting through a maze of alleys and loading docks until his lungs burned. Only when he was safely inside his car, doors locked, did he let himself breathe. He didn't stop driving until the city thinned into quiet residential streets. That night, he met his friend in a diner that hadn't been updated since the 90s, the kind of place where booths offered false privacy and no one asked questions. The friend looked worse than he remembered, eyes sunken, hands restless. A man being hunted by his own mistakes. "You weren't supposed to go there alone," the friend said, voice tight. "You should have told me," he replied flatly. "All of it." The friend exhaled slowly. "I wanted to. I just didn't know how to drag you into this without ruining your life." That ship sailed. when my name ended up on a box of surveillance photos. The friend flinched. They're not just watching you. They're testing you, seeing how far they can push before you break. Why me? He demanded. What do I have that they want? Credibility, the friend said. A clean record, a position that lets you sign things without raising suspicion. You're the perfect shield. The realization hit like a punch. He had always taken pride in being invisible, dependable. Now those same traits had made him useful to predators. My wife? He said quietly. How long has she known? Long enough to be terrified, the friend replied. They showed her what they could do, not just to you, to your reputation. Your future. Anger surged, hot and sharp, so you all decided to lie to me. We decided to buy time, the friend said. She insisted on it, said if you knew too early, you'd try to fix it yourself and get hurt. He looked away, jaw clenched. The image of her in the cafe replayed in his mind, reframed now by fear instead of betrayal. There's someone else involved, the friend continued. The man you saw, he's helping us gather proof, not for revenge, for insurance. And when this insurance policy runs out, he asked. The friend met his gaze. Then the people doing this lose their power. Silence settled between them, heavy but strangely grounding. For the first time since that morning, he felt something like clarity cutting through the panic. When he returned home, she was sitting on the bed, hands folded in her lap. She looked up as he entered, eyes searching his face with quiet desperation. You went to the storage unit, she said softly. He stopped short. You knew. I hoped you wouldn't, she admitted. I wanted to tell you. Every day, I almost did. The words he'd rehearsed dissolved. All that remained was exhaustion and a fragile understanding. Are you in danger? He asked. She swallowed. We both are. He sat beside her, the space between them charged but unbroken. Then no more secrets, he said. Not between us. Tears welled in her eyes, spilling over despite her effort to stay composed. She nodded. That night, they didn't talk much. They didn't touch. But for the first time in weeks, they faced the same direction, and somewhere in the city, unseen and unbothered, the people who had set this in motion tightened their grip, unaware that the man they'd chosen as a pawn was no longer willing to stay blind. Morning arrived without mercy. Light crept through the curtains like an intruder, illuminating the exhaustion on both their faces. He hadn't slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the photographs from the storage unit, the timestamps etched into his memory like accusations. She moved quietly around the bedroom, as if afraid any sudden sound might shatter what little calm they'd managed to hold on to overnight. They drank coffee in silence, not the comfortable kind they used to share on weekends, but a cautious truce, both of them measuring each breath. He studied her hands as she wrapped them around the mug, noticing the faint tremor she tried to hide. They followed me yesterday, she said suddenly, eyes still on the table. His chest tightened. After the cafe. She nodded. Not closely, just enough to remind me they're there. That if I make one wrong move, they'll know. Anger flared, sharp and hot. Then we stop playing defense, he said. We end this. She looked at him then, really looked, as if searching for the reckless man she'd been afraid he'd become. Instead, she found resolve, quiet, dangerous resolve. That's what scares me, she said. They're counting on you reacting. Then they don't know me, he replied. Though the words felt like a promise he wasn't sure he could keep. He went to work as usual, nodding to colleagues, answering emails, performing normalcy with an almost cruel precision. But beneath the surface, his mind cataloged everything differently now. Faces lingered too long. Conversations ended too abruptly. When he stepped outside for lunch, he spotted the same black sedan parked across the street. This time, he didn't look away. He memorized it. That evening, he met the fixer for the first time properly, not through a cafe window or whispered explanations. They chose a public park near the river, crowded enough to blend in, anonymous enough to disappear. The man arrived exactly on time, dressed plainly, carrying himself with the calm of someone who'd learned patience the hard way. "You shouldn't be here," the fixer said after a brief introduction. "But since you are, I won't insult you by pretending otherwise." "I don't want to be protected," he replied. "I want to understand." The fixer studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "Fair? The people targeting you specialize in coercion. They create problems, then offer solutions at a price. Right now, your leverage, your reputation, your access, your marriage, all tools, and my wife," he asked. "She refused to give them what they wanted," the fixer said. "So they escalated. Surveillance, threats, psychological pressure." He exhaled slowly, hearing it laid out so plainly, stripped away the last traces of denial. "How do we stop them?" "We document everything," the fixer replied. "Every call, every message, every mistake they make, and we wait." "I'm tired of waiting," he said. "So are they," the fixer answered. "That's how we win." At home, the tension grew thicker by the hour. She jumped at unexpected sounds. He caught himself checking the locks twice, 3 times. Trust between them was rebuilding, but fear had taken up residence, demanding its share of space. 2 nights later, the unknown number called. He answered without hesitation. "You're becoming a problem," a smooth voice said on the other end. "Problems tend to disappear." "Is that a threat?" he asked calmly, surprising himself. A pause, then a soft chuckle. "A warning. Your wife understands cooperation. I suggest you learn from her." The call ended. His hands shook after, but he didn't drop the phone. Instead, he handed it to her and told her exactly what was said. She listened, face pale but composed. "They're losing patience," she said. "That means they're slipping, or getting desperate," he thought. The next move came faster than expected. A formal notice arrived at his office, an internal audit triggered by anonymous tips, allegations vague but serious enough to freeze accounts and raise eyebrows. The trap was closing. "They're trying to isolate you," the fixer said when he relayed the news. "Make you feel cornered." "I do feel cornered," he admitted. "Good," the fixer replied. "Cornered people pay attention." They worked late into the night, cross-referencing documents, reconstructing timelines, building a map of connections that stretched further than he'd imagined. Shell companies, offshore accounts, names that appeared and vanished like ghosts. And then, finally, a mistake. One transaction too direct. One message sent without encryption. A sliver of arrogance that cracked the armor. "We have enough," the fixer said quietly. "But once we move, there's no going back." He looked at his wife. She reached for his hand, gripping it tightly. "Whatever happens," she said, voice steady despite the fear, "we face it together." The confrontation wasn't dramatic in the way movies promised. No shouting, no drawn weapons. Just a quiet meeting in a glass-walled office where power shifted invisibly, like a current changing direction. The man behind it all, polished, confident, accustomed to control, listened as the fixer laid out the evidence piece by piece. At first, he smiled, then the smile faded. "You think this ruins me?" the man asked, voice sharp now. "I'll bury you in legal fees alone." "Maybe," the fixer replied. "Or maybe you walk away before this becomes public." Silence stretched, heavy and dangerous. In the end, the man chose survival over dominance. Deals were made, threats withdrawn, files disappeared. It wasn't justice in the purest sense, but it was freedom. Weeks later, the audit closed without findings. The black sedan vanished. The calls stopped. Life didn't snap back into place. It stitched itself together slowly, painfully. Therapy sessions replaced late-night arguments. Honest conversations took the place of assumptions. Trust, once cracked, demanded patience to heal. One morning, they sat in the same cafe where everything had begun. Sunlight streamed through the windows. No secrets passed across the table this time, just 2 cups of coffee and hands entwined. He watched her laugh, the familiar gesture of tucking her hair behind her ear, and felt something he hadn't expected. Not relief, gratitude. Because the road he'd changed that morning hadn't led him away from his life. It had led him deeper into it through fear, through betrayal, and finally, toward a truth strong enough to hold them both. The quiet that followed felt unnatural, like the stillness after a storm when the air hasn't decided whether it's safe yet. For days, he kept waiting for the other shoe to drop. No black sedan returned. No unknown numbers lit up his phone. Yet, peace, when it finally arrived, didn't feel like victory. It felt borrowed. He returned to work under a cloud of cautious sympathy. Colleagues spoke softer around him, as if he were fragile glass. The audit had ended cleanly, but whispers lingered. Trust, he was learning, didn't restore itself simply because the threat was gone. It needed proof. Time, consistency. At home, the house felt different. Not broken, rearranged. They cooked together more often, moved around each other with intention. When they talked fully. No phones in hand, no half listening. The silence that once protected secrets now made room for honesty. Still, he noticed things he couldn't unsee. A flinch when a car slowed outside, her hand tightening around his at unexpected moments. Trauma didn't announce its departure politely. It waited. One evening, weeks after the confrontation, his friend showed up unannounced. He looked thinner, older, but lighter somehow, like a man who had finally stopped running. "I heard it's over," the friend said, standing awkwardly in the doorway. "Mostly," he replied. "Come in." They sat across from each other, the weight of shared history filling the space between them. The friend avoided his eyes at first. "I owe you an apology," the friend said, "for dragging you into this, for not trusting you with the truth." He considered the words carefully. "You made bad choices," he said finally, "but you also tried to fix them. That counts for something." The friend nodded, relief flickering across his face. "I'm leaving town," he added. "Fresh start, figure it's time." "Probably is," he said. When the door closed behind him, he felt an unexpected ache. Some chapters didn't end with justice or redemption, just distance. That night, he found her in the living room, sorting through old papers. She looked up as he entered, searching his face. "He came by," he said. She exhaled slowly. "I was wondering when." They sat together on the couch, shoulders touching. The television flickered silently in the background. "I keep thinking about that morning," she said after a while. "If you hadn't changed your route, we'd still be lying to each other," he finished. "And they'd still have control." She nodded. "I hated myself for keeping you in the dark. I hated myself for not noticing you were drowning," he replied. They sat with that truth, letting it settle without blame. Life moved forward, imperfectly but deliberately. Therapy sessions forced them to articulate fears they'd buried for years. He admitted how invisible he'd felt. Long before the threats began, she confessed how lonely she'd been carrying responsibility. Without support, the danger hadn't created their cracks, it had exposed them. Months later, when the first real laugh escaped him without effort, it surprised them both. It happened on a Sunday morning, sunlight spilling across the kitchen floor. She'd burned the toast, again, and tried to blame the toaster. He raised an eyebrow, and she burst out laughing, the sound unguarded and warm. He joined in before he realized what was happening. For a moment, the past loosened its grip. They didn't forget. They learned. New routines formed, shared calendars, open conversations, boundaries that protected instead of confined. Trust rebuilt itself not as blind faith, but as partnership. One afternoon, as he was leaving work, his phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. His stomach dropped instantly. Old reflexes flared. The message read, "You did the right thing. Some of us are still cleaning up the mess you exposed." No threat, no demand, just acknowledgement. He showed it to her that evening. She studied it, then nodded, then maybe something good came out of all this. He realized then that closure didn't always arrive with finality. Sometimes it came quietly, in the knowledge that the truth mattered, even when it hurt. Weeks later, they returned to the cafe again. Not to reclaim it, but to redefine it. They sat by the window, fingers intertwined, watching people hurry past. Unaware of the wars fought in silence, he caught her tucking her hair behind her ear and smiled. "What?" she asked. "Nothing," he said. "Just thinking about how close I came to losing everything, and how close we came to finding it," she replied. As they stood to leave, he glanced at the street where he'd once pulled over. Heart shattered, world collapsing, the road was just a road now, ordinary, unremarkable. But he knew better. One small decision had changed the direction of his life, not by destroying it, but by forcing him to confront it honestly. Betrayal had led to understanding, fear had given way to resilience, and love, tested in ways he never imagined, had survived, not because it was perfect, but because it was chosen. As they walked away together, he felt something settle deep within him. Not certainty, but peace. Peace, he learned, was not a finish line. It was a fragile agreement with the present, one that could be renegotiated at any moment. Weeks passed, then months, and life resumed its familiar rhythms. But he carried a quiet vigilance now, like a second heartbeat. Every morning he drove to work. He still noticed which cars lingered too long at intersections, which faces appeared more than once in a crowd. Old habits from fear did not vanish simply because danger retreated. She noticed it too. One evening, as they washed dishes side by side, she reached for his wrist, grounding him. "You're somewhere else," she said gently. He exhaled. "I keep waiting for the silence to mean something bad." She nodded. "Me too." They stood there, hands in soapy water, sharing a truth neither of them wanted but both understood. Trauma had a way of rewriting instincts. Safety felt suspicious. Calm felt temporary. At work, a new pressure began to form, subtle at first. Meetings about restructuring, quiet conversations in hallways that stopped when he approached. His name mentioned with careful neutrality, he told himself it was coincidence, the normal churn of corporate life. But something in his gut warned him not to dismiss it so easily. Then came the offer. His supervisor called him in late one afternoon, closing the door with deliberate care. "There's an opportunity," she said, folding her hands on the desk. "A role with more responsibility, more visibility." Visibility. The word landed wrong. "What's the catch?" he asked. She smiled thinly. "It's demanding, and given what you've been through recently, I want to be sure you're ready." There it was, the unspoken doubt, the residue of suspicion that no official clearance could fully erase. He went home unsettled. Over dinner, he told her everything, watching her expression shift from curiosity to concern. "They're testing you," she said, "seeing if you'll overextend, or if you're still compromised." He nodded. "It feels like a trap without teeth. Polite, professional, dangerous in a quieter way." That night, he dreamed of the storage unit again, only this time, the box was empty, and the photos were of moments that hadn't happened yet, futures that could still be taken from him. He woke before dawn, heart racing, and decided something had to change. Instead of waiting to be evaluated, he began documenting his own work with meticulous care. Emails saved, decisions logged. Transparency became his shield. If they were watching, he would give them nothing to twist. The effort was exhausting, but it gave him something fear never had: direction. Meanwhile, she faced her own reckoning. The fixer had disappeared back into the margins, but the weight of what she'd done, of what she'd almost lost, pressed on her daily. One afternoon, she confessed something she'd never said out loud. "I thought I was being strong," she admitted, "handling it alone, protecting you, but part of me was also afraid you'd see me differently if you knew how scared I was." He reached for her hand. "I wish you'd let me be scared with you." "So do I," she said. eyes shining. I won't make that mistake again. They began rebuilding, not just trust, but partnership. Decisions were made together now, even small ones, especially small ones. It was slower, messier, but it felt real. Then, just as life began to resemble something stable, the past knocked again softly, but unmistakably. A letter arrived with no return address. Inside was a single page, typed, unsigned. Not everyone agreed with the deal. Some debts don't disappear. His chest tightened as he read it. No threats, no demands, just a reminder that shadows had long memories. He showed it to her immediately. She read it once, then again, jaw set. So, it's not over, she said. Not completely, he replied, but it's different now. This time, they didn't panic. They contacted the fixer's associate, followed established channels, and documented everything. The response came days later. The letter was likely posturing, a remnant of fractured alliances, trying to reclaim relevance. They're weaker than they want you to believe, the message concluded. Fear is their last currency. The words stayed with him. At work, the promotion was offered again, this time with clearer expectations. He accepted not out of ambition, but defiance. He would not shrink himself to appease ghosts. The first weeks were brutal. Long hours, high scrutiny. Every decision felt like a test. But slowly, competence spoke louder than rumor. Colleagues stopped whispering. Trust began to rebuild, not perfectly, but enough. One evening, months later, he stood at the window of their home. Watching the city lights blink on like constellations, she joined him, resting her head against his shoulder. Do you ever think about how close we came to losing this? She asked. All the time, he said. But I also think about how close we came to losing ourselves long before that morning. She smiled sadly. It took fear to wake us up, and honesty to keep us awake, he replied. They planned a short trip, nothing extravagant, just a quiet place near the water, far from routines and reminders. As they walked along the shore, the wind carrying the scent of salt and distance, he felt something unfamiliar, hope, without conditions. Not the naive belief that nothing bad would happen again, but the confidence that if it did, they would face it together. No detours taken alone, no secrets mistaken for strength. On the last night, sitting by a small fire, she squeezed his hand and said, "If you hadn't changed your route that day," he finished the thought gently, "we'd still be living half-truths." She leaned into him, the firelight dancing across her face. "I'm glad you saw me," she said. Even like that, he was too, because seeing the truth, even when it hurt, had given them something fragile, hard-earned, and real. A life no longer defined by fear or betrayal, but by the courage to choose each other again and again, no matter where the road twisted next. The trip by the water should have marked a clean break, a symbolic line between what had been and what could be. For a while, it almost worked. They returned home, lighter, quieter in a good way, as if the ocean had rinsed some of the residue from their nerves. He slept through the night for the first time in months. She stopped jumping at every unfamiliar sound. Normal began to feel possible again. Then the cracks started whispering. It began with a call from his new department, late in the evening, the kind that carried false politeness like a warning label, a project discrepancy. Minor. They said, just needed clarification. He stayed up past midnight, combing through records he already knew were clean. They were. Still, the call unsettled him. It wasn't the problem, it was the timing. The next day, a colleague he barely knew asked a pointed question in the hallway. Casual tone, careful wording, the kind of curiosity that pretends to be friendly while measuring your reaction. He smiled, answered lightly, logged the interaction anyway. At home, she noticed the shift before he mentioned it. She always did now. "They're circling again," she said, not as a question. "I think so," he replied. "But it's not the same people, or not all of them." She frowned. What does that mean? It means when something powerful collapses, it leaves pieces behind. People who didn't get paid. People who think someone owes them. The thought lingered like a bruise. Days later, the email arrived. Anonymous. Carefully worded. No threats, just implications. Mentions of his recent promotion, his access, his wife's past associations. The message ended with a single line that made his stomach drop. Silence can be profitable. He didn't delete it. He didn't reply. He forwarded it. Documented it. Followed every step he'd learned the hard way. Still, something about it felt different. Less blunt. More opportunistic. That night, as they sat together on the couch, he finally voiced the thought that had been forming all day. What if this isn't about revenge? She turned to him slowly. Then what is it about? Recruitment, he said. Someone seeing if I'll fold, if I'll trade integrity for peace. The idea disgusted him more than the threats ever had. Fear was one thing. Corruption was another. She reached for his hand. You won't. I know, he said. But they might not know that yet. The pressure escalated in subtle ways. Invitations to closed-door meetings. Suggestions framed as advice. Comments about how stressful it must be to protect a reputation under scrutiny. No one crossed a line. That was the point. They wanted him off balance. Second-guessing himself, isolated in a room full of polite smiles, he responded with transparency, with questions, with documentation. Each time, he felt the invisible tension rise, like a game where both sides waited for the other to blink. At home, the strain returned, quieter but heavier. She worried he was pushing too hard. He worried that stopping would signal weakness. Old patterns threatened to resurface the instinct to shield, to decide alone. One night, the argument finally happened. You're doing it again, she said, voice shaking. Carrying it all by yourself. I'm trying to keep us safe. He shot back. And I'm trying to stand with you, she replied. You don't get to protect me by shutting me out. The words hit harder than any threat ever had. He sank onto the edge of the bed, head in his hands. I don't know how to do this without becoming someone I hate, he admitted. She knelt in front of him, forcing him to meet her eyes. Then don't become him, she said. Become us. Something shifted, then, not dramatically, not instantly, but enough. They recalibrated, shared everything again. Fear didn't disappear, but it lost its authority. The next move came from an unexpected direction. His old friend, the one who had left town, called after months of silence. The voice on the other end sounded steadier, grounded. I heard some noise, the friend said, about people sniffing around your name again. His jaw tightened. From where? From the same circles I'm trying to stay out of, the friend replied. But listen to me. They're not as organized as before. They're desperate, and desperation makes people sloppy. Why tell me this now? He asked. Because I owe you, the friend said simply. And because if they're making noise, it means you're doing something right. After the call ended, he sat quietly, absorbing the weight of it. The threat was real, but so was the progress. He wasn't the frightened man pulled over on a rainy street anymore. He was informed, supported, prepared. A week later, a formal inquiry landed on his desk, external this time, a request for cooperation, transparency, accountability, the kind that didn't feel like a trap because it wasn't hidden. He agreed immediately. The interview was long, exhausting, meticulous. He answered every question without embellishment or defense. When it was over, he felt wrung out but clean. 2 days later, the follow-up came. The anonymous pressure stopped, emails ceased, meetings relaxed. The silence this time felt earned. At home, he told her everything, and she laughed softly, relief finally breaking through. So this is what fighting back looks like, she said. Not fighting, he corrected, standing. They celebrated quietly, cooking dinner together, music playing low, nothing extravagant, just presence, just now. Later that night, as they lay side by side, She turned to him. Do you ever wish you'd never seen me in that cafe? He didn't hesitate. No, he said. I wish it hadn't hurt the way it did. But I don't wish it away. Why, Iman? Because it forced us to choose each other without illusions, he said. And I'd rather have a real marriage than a comfortable lie. She kissed him then, slow and certain, and for the first time in a long while, the future didn't feel like something to brace against. It felt like something to walk into, eyes open, hands linked, ready for whatever road came next. T, P, T, C, U, C, U, V, T, D. 1.200 tệ, không vì tiêu rẻ, mờ, xe vào trong cờ, đè bờ, and 8. The quiet victory didn't last long enough to feel permanent, but it lasted long enough to change him. For the first time since that morning, by the cafe, he woke without dread sitting on his chest. The world hadn't become safer, but he had become steadier inside it. That difference mattered more than he expected. Work settled into a demanding but honest rhythm. The external inquiry closed with formal thanks and no further action. His name, once whispered, was now spoken plainly again. People met his eyes. Trust, he realized, didn't always return with apologies. Sometimes it returned with consistency. At home, they fell into something like peace. Not the careless peace of before, but a deliberate one. They planned their weeks together, shared access to everything, phones, calendars, fears. The openness felt strange at first, like walking without armor. But slowly it became grounding instead of frightening. Then, one evening, she came home later than usual. Not alarmingly late, just enough to trigger old instincts. He checked himself before panic could take hold. He reminded himself who he was now. When she finally walked through the door, she looked shaken, not guilty, not secretive, just unsettled. Something happened, she said quietly. His pulse quickened, but his voice stayed even. Talk to me. She set her bag down, hands trembling slightly. I was followed today. Not like before. This was different. His jaw tightened. Different how? They didn't try to hide, she said. They wanted me to see them. Anger, flared hot and protective. Did they say anything? No, she replied. But they left something. She reached into her bag and pulled out a folded paper. His stomach dropped the moment he saw it. A printed photograph. It was old, grainy, slightly faded. A picture of him years ago, standing beside someone he hadn't seen in a long time, someone whose name he hadn't spoken aloud in years. She watched his face carefully. Who is that? He swallowed. Someone I used to know, he said, from before you. The silence that followed was heavy, but not accusing. What does it mean? She asked. I don't know, he admitted, but I know why they'd use it. That night, sleep didn't come easily. The past he'd buried had been quiet for so long he'd convinced himself it no longer mattered. But someone, somewhere, had dug it up, and that meant the threat had shifted. This wasn't about leverage through fear anymore. It was about exposure. The next morning, he reached out to the one person he'd hoped never to involve again, the fixer's associate. The reply came hours later. Cautious but attentive. This changes things, the message read. If they're reaching that far back, they're running out of present-day pressure. So they're escalating, he typed. Or unraveling, came the reply. He spent the day revisiting a version of himself he barely recognized. The man in the photograph had been younger, reckless, someone who believed consequences belonged to other people. He hadn't committed crimes, but he'd stood close enough to them to get burned if the light ever shone too bright. He had walked away before things turned ugly. Apparently, not far enough. That evening, he told her everything, the mistakes, the near misses. The choices he'd made to leave that life behind without ever explaining why. She listened without interruption, without judgment. When he finished, she took his hand. Why didn't you tell me before? She asked gently. I was ashamed. he said, and afraid you'd see me differently. She squeezed his fingers. I see you more clearly now. The words broke something open in him, something he hadn't realized he was still guarding. 2 days later, the message arrived. No anonymity this time. Just a name, a meeting request, a location. They want to talk, he said, showing her the screen. She didn't hesitate. Then we don't go alone. The fixer's associate agreed to observe from a distance. Legal boundaries were set. Documentation prepared. No improvisation. The meeting place was a private lounge in a mid-level hotel neutral ground. He arrived early, heart steady, mind sharp. When the man finally approached, recognition hit instantly. Not the face, but the demeanor. The kind of confidence that fed on imbalance. You've been busy, the man said smoothly, sitting across from him. Not as busy as you, he replied. The man smiled thinly. We prefer the term. Resourceful. You followed my wife, he said flatly. She's visible, the man replied. You were harder to reach. What do you want? He asked. The man leaned back. Alignment. You're in a position now. Access, influence. We can make life very comfortable. And if I say no, the man shrugged. Then we remind people of who you used to be. He felt the familiar surge of anger, but it didn't control him. He'd rehearsed this moment without knowing it. You don't have anything, he said calmly. And you know it. If you did, you'd already have used it. The man's smile faltered, just slightly. You think you're protected, the man said. You think your transparency saved you. No, he replied. I think it made you irrelevant. Silence stretched between them. Finally, the man stood. This isn't over, he said. He didn't rise to the bait. It is for me. The fallout was quieter than expected. No retaliation, no dramatic collapse, just distance. The man vanished from the edges of his life, as suddenly as he'd appeared. Weeks passed. Then months. The photograph never resurfaced. One night, long after the fear had dulled into memory, they sat together on the porch, watching the city breathe. I used to think strength meant hiding the parts of myself that could be used against me, he said softly. And now, she asked. Now I think strength is making sure they never surprise me again, he replied, because I've already faced them. She leaned against him, warm and steady. I'm glad you didn't face them alone. He kissed the top of her head, the weight of everything they'd survived, settling into something like gratitude. The road he'd changed that morning hadn't just exposed a secret. It had forced him to confront every version of himself, past, present, and future, and choose, again and again, who he was willing to be. And this time, there were no shadows left to threaten him, only choices. And the courage to stand by them. The disappearance of the man from the hotel lounge should have felt like closure. In some ways, it did. The city seemed to exhale with him gone, as if an invisible tension had been lifted from the streets he walked every day. But absence, he learned, was not the same as safety. Sometimes it was only proof that a threat had learned to retreat quietly. Life resumed its pace. But with a different weight, he noticed how often people took normalcy for granted, how coworkers complained about trivial deadlines, how neighbors argued about parking spaces, how strangers scrolled their phones at crosswalks, unaware of how fragile certainty really was. He envied them, a little. Then he reminded himself that ignorance wasn't peace. Awareness was. At home, the balance they'd built held for the most part, but there were nights when she woke suddenly, breath caught in her throat, eyes scanning the dark, as if expecting it to speak back. He would pull her close, grounding both of them, and they'd lie there listening to the quiet until it softened again. One evening, while sorting through old files on his laptop, he found something he hadn't expected. A draft resignation letter, dated months ago. Written by him, forgotten in the chaos. He read it slowly, absorbing the words of a man who'd been ready to run. He closed the file without deleting it. The next morning, He requested a meeting with his supervisor, not to discuss work, but boundaries. He laid everything out calmly. What he could handle, what he would no longer tolerate, what transparency looked like for him now. The conversation was tense but respectful. When it ended, he felt lighter, as if he'd reclaimed a piece of himself that fear had quietly negotiated away. That afternoon, she called him from work, her voice unusually steady. "I think I need to do something too," she said. "What do you mean?" he asked. "I've been living in reaction mode," she replied. "Ever since this started, I don't want to anymore." They met for lunch, sitting across from each other in a small park where sunlight filtered through the trees. She told him about the job offer she'd turned down months earlier, something she'd been afraid to pursue because it would have made her more visible. "I don't want to shrink my life to stay safe," she said. "I want to expand it." He watched her as she spoke, admiration replacing the lingering worry in his chest. "Then do it," he said simply. "We'll handle the rest." Change came slowly, then all at once. She accepted the position. He adjusted his schedule. They renegotiated routines, support systems, expectations. It wasn't always smooth. Some days exhaustion crept back in, whispering old doubts. But they recognized it now, named it, refused to let it decide for them. Then, just when the past seemed finally settled, a new detail surfaced, small but unsettling. He received a call from a number he recognized, but hadn't seen in years. A former colleague from his early career. Someone adjacent to the life he'd once brushed too close. "I wasn't sure if I should call," the voice said hesitantly. "But I thought you should know. People are asking questions again." His stomach tightened. "About what?" "About who cleaned up the mess," the colleague replied. "About who refused to play along." A pause. "Your name came up." After the call ended, he sat in silence, letting the implications settle. The network he'd disrupted hadn't disappeared. It had fragmented, and fragments had a way of cutting unexpectedly. He told her that night, watching her carefully. Fear flickered, but it didn't take root. "So, they're still out there," she said. "Yes, and we're still standing," she replied. The resolve in her voice steadied him. They decided not to retreat this time. Not emotionally, not logistically. They updated their security measures, leaned on professional advice, stayed visible rather than hiding. Darkness thrived on isolation. They refused to give it that comfort. Weeks passed without incident, then months. One crisp morning, he received an email from the fixer's associate, short, direct. "An investigation concluded today. Several names you'd recognize are no longer in positions to cause harm. Consider this chapter. Contained. Contained. Not erased, but managed." That night, they celebrated quietly, takeout on the living room floor, music playing low, laughter that came easily now, without checking itself first. At some point, she leaned her head on his shoulder and sighed. "I don't think I realized how heavy everything was," she said. "Not until it stopped pressing down all the time." He kissed her temple. "Me neither." Later, as they cleaned up together, he paused, dish in hand. "There's something I've been meaning to tell you." She turned to him, attentive but unafraid. "I almost quit," he admitted, "almost disappeared, before all this came to the surface." She studied his face, then nodded. "I'm glad you didn't." "So am I," he said. "But I needed you to know how close I came, too on." She stepped closer, wrapping her arms around him. "We both came close," she said softly. "And we stayed." The simplicity of it struck him. Staying had been the bravest choice they'd made. Months later, they returned to the same river where he'd once parked in confusion and fear. This time, they walked hand in hand, watching the water move steadily past, indifferent to secrets and revelations alike. "Do you ever think about that first moment?" she asked. "When you saw me through the cafe window," he smiled faintly. "All the time." "And," she prompted. "And I think about how easy it would have been to choose anger," he said. "How tempting it would have been to let that moment define us." "But it didn't," she said. "No," he agreed. We decided what it meant. The wind moved gently across the water, carrying the sounds of the city with it. He felt something settle in his chest. Not relief, not triumph, but acceptance. The story hadn't ended when the threats stopped. It ended when fear lost its authority over their choices. And that, he realized, was a kind of freedom no one could take away. Freedom, he discovered, brought with it an unexpected responsibility. Without fear dictating his movements, there was no one left to blame for the choices ahead. Life no longer pushed him from behind. It waited, patient and demanding, asking what he intended to do with the clarity he'd fought so hard to earn. The answer didn't come immediately. Days slipped into weeks, and the city settled into early autumn. Leaves gathered along sidewalks, crunching underfoot like quiet punctuation marks. He noticed how often he'd started to measure time, not by deadlines or meetings, but by emotional weather. Calm days, heavy ones, days when the past drifted close enough to touch, and days when it felt distant, like a story he'd once read rather than lived. At work, the new role continued to test him. Visibility meant scrutiny. Every decision carried weight. And not all of it was fair. He caught glimpses of skepticism in meetings, subtle reminders that trust, once fractured, rebuilt itself slowly. Still, he leaned into the discomfort. He asked questions others avoided, documented everything. He refused shortcuts even when they were offered discreetly, wrapped in smiles and plausible deniability. Some people respected that, others resented it. One afternoon, after a particularly tense meeting, he lingered behind while the room emptied. A senior colleague approached him, voice low. "You know," the man said, "not everyone appreciates the spotlight you're shining." "I'm not trying to shine anything," he replied. "I'm just doing the job." The man studied him, then nodded slowly. "Just be careful," he said. "Transparency makes enemies. So does secrecy," he answered. The exchange lingered with him long after the man walked away. It wasn't a threat. It was a reminder. Power didn't disappear when exposed. It adapted. At home, she sensed the strain, even when he tried to hide it. One evening, she set aside her laptop and turned to him, eyes thoughtful. "You're carrying something," she said. He considered brushing it off. Old instinct. But he'd promised himself he wouldn't do that anymore. "I'm wondering if I'm pushing too hard," he admitted. "If standing firm is just another way of inviting conflict." She shook her head gently. "You're not inviting it. You're refusing to pretend it isn't there." He smiled faintly. "When did you get so wise?" She laughed softly. "When I got tired of being afraid." They sat together, letting the moment settle. He realized then that the work they'd done on themselves, on their marriage, had changed how they faced uncertainty. It no longer fractured them. It drew them closer. A week later, the invitation arrived. An industry conference, panel discussion, his name listed among the speakers. The email was brief, professional, an opportunity, it said, to share insights on ethics, accountability, and leadership under pressure. He stared at the screen longer than necessary. "Do you want to do it?" she asked when he told her. "I don't know," he replied honestly. "Part of me wants to stay quiet. The other part feels like that's exactly what they expect." She considered him carefully. "What would the man you were a year ago do?" "Hide," he said without hesitation. "And the man you are now," he exhaled, "show up." The conference hall was larger than he'd imagined. Bright lights, rows of chairs, faces turned toward the stage with polite interest. As he waited his turn to speak, he felt the familiar surge of nerves, but it was different now. Less panic, more focus. When he finally stepped to the podium, the room quieted. He didn't tell his whole story. He didn't need to. He spoke about integrity under pressure, about the cost of silence, about how systems failed when people assumed someone else would act. He spoke carefully, choosing words that were truthful without being reckless. As he talked, he noticed subtle reactions. Some people leaned forward, others stiffened. A few avoided his gaze altogether. Good, he thought. Let them feel seen. Afterward, a woman approached him near the exit. She introduced herself quietly, glancing around before speaking. "Thank you," she said, "for saying what you said." "You're welcome," he replied. "It wasn't easy," she nodded. "It never is, but it helps more than you know." The encounter stayed with him. That night, back at home, he felt a strange mix of exhaustion and relief. He'd stepped into the open, and the sky hadn't fallen. If anything, it had widened. She poured them each a glass of wine, raising hers slightly. "To showing up," she said. "To showing up," he echoed. In the weeks that followed, small things began to shift. Conversations changed tone. Doors opened that hadn't before. It wasn't dramatic, but it was real. He wasn't naive enough to believe everything was suddenly safe, but he was no longer invisible. And invisibility, he'd learned, had its own dangers. One evening, as they walked through their neighborhood, he spotted the cafe from months ago in the distance. The sight no longer tightened his chest. It felt like a marker on a long road, already traveled. "You okay?" she asked, noticing his gaze. "Yeah," he said, "just thinking about how much can change without you realizing it." She squeezed his hand. "You mean how much you changed?" He smiled. "We did." Later that night, lying in bed, he reflected on how differently he would have handled everything if he'd confronted her that morning in anger. How easily the truth could have been buried beneath accusations. How close they'd come to becoming strangers, standing on opposite sides of fear. Instead, they'd chosen curiosity over rage, honesty over control, partnership over pride. The threats hadn't vanished because they were weak. They'd vanished because he and his wife had stopped being useful to them. Fear no longer made decisions on their behalf. Silence no longer bought peace. As sleep finally claimed him, one thought lingered, steady and grounding. The road he'd changed that day hadn't just revealed a secret, it had revealed him to himself. And once you saw yourself clearly, he realized, it became very hard for anyone else to use your reflection against you. The clarity he'd gained didn't make life simpler, it made it sharper. Every choice carried definition now. Edges he couldn't ignore. The days after the conference were busy, but not chaotic. Purpose had a way of organizing things that fear never could. Then, on a quiet Thursday evening, the past pressed back in. It came disguised as routine. He was halfway through dinner when his phone vibrated with a notification from an unfamiliar app, one he hadn't installed. His fork paused midair. "What is it?" she asked, already alert. He turned the screen toward her. A single message glowed against the dark background. "We need to talk. Tonight." No signature. No threat. Just urgency. His pulse quickened, but he didn't feel the old panic. Instead, he felt irritation. Someone was trying to reclaim relevance. He locked the phone and set it face down. "Someone fishing," he said, "seeing if I'll bite." She studied him carefully. "Do you want to?" He considered it. The fixer's associate had warned him that silence was sometimes the safest answer, but also that control thrived on unanswered questions. "Yes," he said finally, "but not on their terms." They spent the next hour preparing not for confrontation, but for containment. Screenshots saved, location sharing enabled, a call scheduled with the associate to monitor remotely. Everything documented, no improvisation. The meeting location arrived minutes later. A parking garage near the edge of downtown, neutral, exposed. Poor choice for someone seeking leverage. "I'll go," he said. "You stay home." She shook her head immediately. No more doing this alone. They compromised. She would stay nearby, visible, but not involved. A reminder to both sides that he wasn't isolated anymore. The garage smelled of oil and damp concrete. Fluorescent lights flickered overhead as he parked and stepped out, scanning shadows out of habit rather than fear. A figure approached from between two columns, hands visible, posture casual. It was a woman this time, mid-40s, professional. Her expression held a practiced neutrality, that told him everything he needed to know. "You made quite an impression," she said as she stopped a few feet away. "Funny," he replied. "That's what people say when they want something." She smiled faintly, direct. "I appreciate that. What do you want?" he asked. "To understand you," she said. "You disrupted something valuable. People don't like uncertainty." "Neither do I," he replied. "But here we are." She studied him for a moment, eyes sharp. "You've been very visible lately. That makes some people nervous." "Good," he said. "They should be." The smile faded. "Careful," she warned. "Confidence can be mistaken for provocation. Only by people who expect obedience," he replied evenly. Silence stretched. The hum of distant traffic echoed through the structure. "We could make things easier for you," she offered. "You have influence now. You could steer outcomes. Quietly." "And if I say no?" he asked. She tilted her head. "Then we reassess." He stepped back slightly, creating space. "This conversation is over," he said. "You don't have leverage, and you know it. That's why you came yourself." Her eyes narrowed, just a fraction. "You think transparency protects you?" "No," he said. "I know it limits you." Another pause. Then she nodded, once. "Very well." She turned and walked away without another word. He waited until she disappeared before exhaling. His phone vibrated confirmation from the associate that everything had been recorded. When he returned to the car, she was waiting. Engine running, eyes searching his face. "It's done," he said. She nodded, relief washing over her features. They drove home in silence, the city lights passing like distant memories rather than threats. The next morning, an internal memo circulated at work. New compliance measures, revised oversight procedures, subtle, structural, permanent. Someone higher up had decided uncertainty was too costly to ignore. He read the memo twice, then forwarded it to the associate. "Looks like the ripple reached shore." The reply came back. Life shifted again. Quieter this time. Not because the danger had vanished, but because it had lost momentum. The people who thrived on leverage had moved on to easier targets. At home, they marked the change in small ways. A weekend trip planned without hesitation. Laughter without checking the door. Trust that didn't need constant reinforcement. One night, months later, they sat on the balcony watching the city settle into sleep. "Do you ever miss who you were before all this?" she asked softly. He thought about it. The man who believed certainty was guaranteed, who thought loyalty meant silence, who avoided conflict by pretending it didn't exist. "No," he said. "I miss the simplicity, but not the blindness." She smiled. "Me neither." He realized then that the story they'd lived through hadn't been about betrayal at all. Not really. It had been about awakening, about seeing the systems that benefited from fear and choosing not to feed them anymore. The road he'd changed that morning had forced him into the open, stripped of assumptions and illusions. And in that exposure, he'd found something steadier than certainty. Agency. As the city lights dimmed one by one, he felt a calm that no threat could counterfeit. Whatever came next, whatever shadows tried to stretch their reach, he knew this much. He would meet it with eyes open, voice steady, and his hand firmly intertwined with hers, not because the world was safe, but because he was no longer willing to live as if it wasn't his to claim. The months that followed settled into something almost ordinary, and that ordinariness felt earned, not given. Not guaranteed, earned through vigilance, honesty, and a refusal to slip back into old habits. He noticed how differently he moved through the world now. His shoulders no longer hunched instinctively when a stranger lingered too long. His thoughts no longer leapt to worst-case conclusions at the first sign of disruption. Awareness remained, but it no longer ruled him. Still, he knew better than to believe the story was finished. The first sign came quietly. A change in tone at work. Not suspicion, respect, the kind that came with expectations. He was asked to lead a small internal review team, a role designed to assess vulnerabilities before they became crises. It was flattering. It was also telling. They weren't just trusting him anymore. They were relying on him. He accepted after discussing it with her. Both of them aware of what visibility could attract. But they also understood something crucial now. Hiding had never kept them safe. It had only kept them uninformed. The work was intense. He reviewed processes most people avoided, tracing decisions backward until motives surfaced. Patterns emerged, not corruption, exactly more like convenience layered over time. Small compromises that accumulated until no one remembered where the line had been. One evening, after a long day, he came home quieter than usual. She noticed immediately. "You found something," she said. "Not yet," he replied. "But I'm close." She set aside what she was doing and waited. Silence had become something they used intentionally now. A space rather than a wall. "There's a department that keeps appearing on the edges," he continued. "Always adjacent, never responsible, but always benefiting." Her expression tightened. "Is it connected to before?" "I don't know," he admitted, "but the structure feels familiar." That night, he dreamed of corridors, long, windowless halls, with doors that opened into other doors, no exits. He woke with a sense of urgency he couldn't fully explain. 2 days later, the confirmation arrived. An encrypted message from the fixer's associate, brief and precise. "Be careful." Your name surfaced in a conversation it shouldn't have. His chest tightened. But he didn't panic. He forwarded the message to his secure folder and closed the app. At dinner, he told her everything. "So it's circling back," she said. "Or trying to," he replied. "But this time, it's stepping into the light." She reached across the table, covering his hand. "Then you won't face it alone." The next phase unfolded not with threats, but with invitations. Meetings framed as collaboration. Requests for opinions that carried subtle expectations. He recognized the tactic immediately. Inclusion as leverage. He responded carefully, asked questions, requested documentation, redirected decisions into formal channels. Each time, he felt the invisible tension tighten, like a net being pulled too far. Finally, someone blinked. A whistleblower report surfaced anonymously detailed, methodical, impossible to dismiss. The department he'd noticed was named explicitly, transactions flagged, correspondence attached. He wasn't surprised. He was relieved. The investigation that followed was swift and unmistakably real. External auditors, legal counsel, no quiet resolutions this time. The organization had learned its lesson. Silence had cost too much. During the weeks that followed, he felt the familiar weight of scrutiny, but this time, it wasn't isolating. Colleagues checked in. Leadership communicated clearly. The process, while stressful, was transparent. At home, she supported him in ways both small and profound. Late-night meals, gentle reminders to rest, quiet reassurance when doubt crept in uninvited. "You're doing the right thing," she told him one night, as he paced the living room, rehearsing answers to questions he'd already prepared for. "I know," he said. "It just feels strange being on this side of it." "The side where truth matters?" she asked softly. He smiled. "Yes." The fallout was decisive. Several resignations, public statements, a restructuring that would take years to fully settle. Through it all, he remained steady, careful not to claim credit or deflect responsibility. When it was over, the fixer's associate sent a final message. "This one won't come back. Too much daylight." He read it twice before closing the thread. The sense of relief that followed was different from before. Deeper, less reactive. It didn't feel like survival. It felt like closure. Weeks later, on a quiet Sunday afternoon, they sat together on the balcony, the city humming below. She rested her head against his shoulder, a familiar gesture that now carried no weight of fear. "Do you realize," she said thoughtfully, "that everything changed because you chose not to explode that morning?" He laughed softly. "Trust me, that wasn't a calculated choice." "But it became one," she said. "You chose curiosity instead of anger. You chose to wait." He considered that. I chose you, he said finally. She tilted her head to look at him, eyes warm. You chose yourself too. The realization settled gently. She was right. Somewhere along the way, he'd stopped defining himself by what others could do to him and started defining himself by what he refused to become. That night, as they prepared for bed, he paused at the window, looking out at the city lights. He thought about the road he'd changed months ago, how random it had felt, how unfair, how violent the shift had been. And yet, if he hadn't changed that route, he would still be moving through life half asleep, trusting systems that didn't deserve it, protecting peace that wasn't real. He would still believe that loyalty meant silence, that love meant enduring alone. Instead, he'd learned something harder and far more valuable. Truth didn't guarantee safety, but it gave you direction. As he turned off the light and joined her in bed, he felt a quiet certainty settle in his chest. Whatever challenges waited ahead, whatever shadows tried to stretch their reach, he knew how to meet them now. Not with fear, not with rage, but with clarity, honesty, and the courage to stand fully present in his own life. And for the first time since that rainy morning, the future didn't feel like something lurking just beyond the glass. It felt like something he was finally walking toward, eyes open, unafraid, and no longer alone. The sense of closure lingered longer this time, not as a fragile pause, but as a quiet recalibration of how he understood his place in the world. He didn't wake each morning braced for impact anymore. Instead, he woke with intention. That difference showed in everything from how he spoke in meetings to how he listened at home. Still, closure had a way of revealing what came next. The restructuring at work left gaps, positions vacated, responsibilities redistributed. Leadership asked him to stay on, not just as a contributor, but as a stabilizing presence. He hesitated, not because he doubted his ability, but because he recognized the cost. Visibility required energy. Integrity required vigilance. He discussed it with her, over a long walk through the neighborhood. Leaves crunching underfoot. You don't have to carry the whole thing, she said, sensing his hesitation. I know, he replied. But if I step away now, someone else fills the space. And I don't know who that would be. She stopped walking and faced him. Then don't do it alone, she said. Set boundaries. Build allies. Let people see how it's done. Her confidence steadied him. He agreed to stay temporarily, deliberately, on his terms. He began assembling a small team, chosen not for ambition, but for consistency. People who asked uncomfortable questions. People who documented rather than speculated. People who didn't confuse speed with progress. The work was slower. It was also cleaner. Not everyone appreciated the change. A few weeks in, an anonymous comment surfaced on an internal forum. Nothing overtly hostile, just a familiar insinuation. Accusations of self-righteousness, of moral posturing, of someone who forgot how the real world works. He read it once, then closed the window. At home, he mentioned it in passing. She listened, then smiled faintly. That's the sound of friction, she said. It means you're moving. He laughed quietly. You're getting very good at this. I had a good teacher, she replied. One evening, as they cooked dinner together, his phone buzzed with a message from a number he hadn't seen in years. A former mentor, someone he'd respected, someone who had drifted away during the earlier chaos. I've been watching from a distance, the message read. If you're willing, I'd like to talk. They met a few days later in a small cafe, different from the one that had started everything, but similar enough to feel symbolic. The mentor looked older, more cautious, but sincere. I didn't reach out before because I didn't know where I stood, the man admitted. But I see what you're doing now. And, he asked, and it matters, the mentor said. Not just to you, to people who've been waiting for someone to stop pretending the system fixes itself. The conversation stretched longer than planned. Advice was exchanged, and mistakes acknowledged. When they parted, he felt something unexpected. Validation that didn't depend on approval, but alignment. That night, he told her about the meeting. She listened, then said, "You're not just surviving anymore. You're influencing." The word sat with him. Influence wasn't power. It wasn't control. It was responsibility. Quiet, cumulative, often invisible, and it scared him less than he thought it would. The next test came without warning. A junior member of his team requested a private meeting. The man's hands shook slightly as he spoke, voice low. "I found something," he said, "and I don't know what to do with it." The document he slid across the desk wasn't explosive. It was worse. Subtle inconsistencies, patterns that suggested shortcuts. Nothing illegal yet, but trending dangerously close. "This is how it starts," the man said. "I've seen it before." He recognized the fear immediately. Not of consequences, but of isolation. "You did the right thing," he said. "And you won't handle it alone." They followed protocol. Raised the concern carefully. Brought in oversight early. The issue was addressed before it metastasized. No headlines, no fallout, just correction. Afterward, the junior team member stopped him in the hallway. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for not making me feel like I was overreacting." He thought of that morning months ago, how easily he could have overreacted, how costly that would have been. At home, life unfolded in gentler rhythms. They hosted friends again, planned holidays without contingency strategies, laughed without scanning the room. Yet the growth wasn't just relief, it was depth. One night, as they sorted through old photos, she paused at an image of them from years earlier, younger, unaware. "We look happy," she said softly. "We were," he replied. "Just incomplete." She considered that. "Do you miss that version of us?" He shook his head. "I'm grateful for them, but I trust us now in a way I didn't then." She smiled, eyes shining. "Me too." The city shifted into winter. Lights appeared in windows. The air sharpened. With the season came reflection, natural, unavoidable. He found himself thinking less about what they'd endured and more about what they'd built because of it. One evening, standing at the same balcony where they'd once talked about fear losing its authority, he felt the weight of that truth fully settle. Fear hadn't vanished, it had been demoted. She joined him, slipping her arm through his. "What are you thinking?" she asked. "That I used to believe peace was the absence of trouble," he said. "Now I think it's the presence of choice." She nodded. "And trust, he agreed. The road he'd changed that morning no longer felt like an accident. It felt like an interruption that saved him from a life half-lived, from assumptions untested, from love unchallenged. He knew there would be more tests ahead, more moments requiring clarity over comfort. But he also knew this. He had learned how to stay present when it mattered most. As the city lights flickered on below, he felt steady, not triumphant, not invincible, just awake. And that, he realized, was enough to carry him and them forward into whatever came next. Winter deepened, and with it came a quieter kind of pressure, not the sharp urgency of threats or confrontations, but the slow weight of consequence. The changes he'd helped set in motion were no longer abstract. They were lived. Policies reshaped workflows. Decisions once made in closed rooms were now questioned in open ones. Some people adapted, others resisted. Quietly but persistently, he felt it most in the pauses. Conversations that stopped when he entered a room. Smiles that didn't quite reach the eyes. Not hostility, exactly. More like caution. He had become predictable in an inconvenient way. He would ask for documentation. He would slow things down. He would insist on clarity, predictability. He was learning, could be disruptive. At home, she noticed the toll it took on him before he admitted it to himself. One evening, as snow tapped softly against the windows, she set down her book and studied him. "You're tired in a different way," she said. He leaned back on the couch, rubbing his temples. "I thought once the big threats were gone, things would feel easier. And they don't." she said gently. No, he admitted. They feel heavier. Like what I do now actually matters. She smiled faintly. That's because it does. The truth of it settled between them. Responsibility didn't come with the adrenaline of crisis. It came with endurance, with showing up when no one was watching, with choosing the harder path again and again without applause. A week later, the tension crystallized into something undeniable. An emergency meeting was called. Upper leadership, legal counsel, external advisors. The agenda was vague, but the tone was not. He walked into the room, already knowing what it would be about: a proposal framed as a solution, a compromise, a way to protect the organization from further disruption. The language was careful, polished, and deeply familiar. We need to draw a line, one executive said. We can't investigate everything forever, another added. There has to be trust at some point. He listened, silent, as the room leaned toward consensus. The proposal wouldn't erase wrongdoing, but it would cap accountability, close the door, just short of uncomfortable truths. When the room finally turned to him, expectant, his pulse remained steady. You're asking for certainty, he said calmly. But what you're really asking for is quiet. A few faces stiffened. Quiet is what got us here. He continued. Not curiosity, not scrutiny. Quiet. One executive sighed. You're idealizing risk, she said. At some point, leadership means knowing when to stop digging. He met her gaze. Leadership also means knowing what happens if we don't. Silence settled, thick and charged. They voted anyway. The proposal passed narrowly. He didn't argue further. He didn't storm out. He simply nodded, gathered his notes, and left the room with a clarity that surprised even him. At home that night, he told her everything. She listened without interruption, her expression thoughtful rather than alarmed. So, they chose comfort, she said. Yes, he replied, and I chose not to fight it. She raised an eyebrow slightly. That doesn't sound like you. It is now, he said. Because I finally understand something, he explained slowly, carefully. That forcing change from within had limits. That integrity wasn't about winning every battle. That sometimes the most honest response was refusal, quiet, documented, undeniable. The next morning, he submitted his resignation. Not impulsive, not angry, detailed, transparent, professional. When the email sent, he felt no rush of fear, only a strange calm. The reaction was immediate. Calls, messages, requests to reconsider, meetings offered, promises made. He listened politely, then declined. Not because he doubted their sincerity, but because he recognized the pattern: pressure disguised as concern, urgency framed as opportunity. He had already lived that story. At home, the shift was palpable, not panic possibility. They sat together at the kitchen table, coffee cooling between them, talking through logistics like partners who trusted each other completely. What do you want to do? She asked. He considered it honestly. Something slower, he said. Something that aligns. She smiled. I was hoping you'd say that. The weeks that followed were transitional, but not uncertain. Consulting work trickled in organizations seeking the kind of clarity he'd become known for. He chose carefully, turned down more than he accepted. Time, once scarce, became intentional. They reclaimed small rituals, morning walks, unrushed dinners, evenings spent planning nothing in particular. One afternoon, while sorting through old files, he came across the photograph again, the one that had once been used as leverage. He held it for a long moment, then placed it back in the drawer without ceremony. It had no power now. Late winter softened into early spring. The city thawed. Light lingered longer in the evenings. One night, as they walked past the café that had once marked the beginning of everything, he felt no surge of memory, only gratitude. Do you ever think about how different this all could have gone? She asked quietly. All the time, he replied. I could have confronted you, burned everything down, and instead, she asked, instead, I listened, he said, and learned. They stopped at the corner, watching people inside the cafe laugh, talk, live unaware of the turning points happening around them every day. She squeezed his hand. I'm glad you saw more than what was in front of you. So am I, he said. That night, lying beside her, he reflected on the arc of it all, the fear, the betrayal he'd imagined, the truth that had emerged slowly and painfully. He realized the most radical change hadn't been external at all. It was the moment he stopped defining himself by what he could lose. Walking away from power hadn't diminished him. It had clarified him. As sleep pulled him under, he felt a quiet certainty anchor in his chest, not about the future's shape, but about his place within it. He was no longer reacting to shadows. He was choosing his light. And whatever came next, he would meet it not as a man trying to protect a fragile life, but as someone finally living an honest one. Sometimes the greatest betrayals are not the ones committed against us, but the ones we imagine when fear speaks louder than truth. This story reminds us that life-changing moments often arrive disguised as accidents. One wrong turn, one unexpected sight, one pause instead of an explosion. Real strength isn't found in control or confrontation, but in the courage to listen, to question our assumptions, and to choose honesty, even when it hurts. Trust is not about knowing everything. It's about facing uncertainty together instead of alone. And healing doesn't mean returning to who we were before. It means becoming someone braver, clearer, and more awake than we ever were. When we stop letting fear decide for us, we don't just save relationships, we reclaim ourselves. If this story resonated with you, share your thoughts in the comments below. What part moved you the most? Or what lesson stayed with you? And if you enjoy deep, emotional stories that explore betrayal, truth, and healing, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and join us for more stories that speak to the heart.